morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to have you all here today again. I see a lot of familiar names. I can't say faces because I can't see your face, but I see a lot of familiar names, and I'm pleased to see that we're still all here in these forums to exchange experiences. We find them very fruitful. On behalf of the Apple Project and its partners, we have FAO, WWF, UNDP, and all other organizations. We're proud to have you here today. You know that the YAPA project is just finishing after almost 7 years of working in the region. We are carrying out the last few activities, and we're really pleased to see that this community has developed around the protected areas of the Amazon to continue with the work of the Amazon area that since 2008 we've been developing and promoting. So once again, thank you very much for being here with us in this forum. Thank you to the lecturers from Imparques, the Cernam, who will tell us all about their experiences on the shared reserves that have given a great example to the whole region, and also our colleagues from the National Natural Parks of Colombia with the experience of the Yapaporis Park. And certainly we will learn a lot today, and we will look at these experiences that have been so wonderful throughout the region, specifically on Amazon issues, on protected areas of the Amazon. And once again, we wanted to thank the working group of the Amazon Vision Working Group that has devoted so much time to the courses, designing the webinars, establishing the contacts, thinking technically what these examples and best practices for the region are. And of course, the colleagues of the UCI and ELAB that have assisted this whole process so successfully. So I just wanted to wish you all a great session, and I'm sure we will see each other. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Claudia. Very kind for being with us as usual. So we will now grant the word to Claudia Núñez, our colleague from the National Parks of Colombia, who leads the working group on the Amazon Vision Working Group, and will tell us a little bit about the framework of the working group of the governance group. Claudia, go ahead. Thank you very much, Christina. Greetings to all. As Claudia mentioned, I see a lot of familiar names. That's a great indicator of the learning community that we have been developing. I welcome you to this course, this webinar. This is all part of a capacity building course on the governance of protected area, in this case, Amazon-based. And was focused not only on the protected area staff of the 8 countries and of the French territories who make up the Amazon vision of the Parks Network, but it's also an opportunity to have other stakeholders with whom we share governance in the territories to participate. We have ministries of foreign affairs, ministries of transportation, tourism, indigenous communities, local governments. So it's a multi-stakeholder group that allows to enrich the different perspectives of governance in protected areas. The working and governance group of the Amazon Vision of the Park Networks is a group that was established in 2010 that encompasses all 8 countries in the Amazon biome and the French overseas territories of French Guyana. And in our integration project, YAPA, as it was just presented by our coordinator, Claudia Marin, the working group on governance, hand in hand with the academic world, which is another important element that we need to highlight here, which is the Latin American School of Protected Areas, since last year has established this learning community. And we have achieved also, as another positive by the pandemic, to celebrate these courses with a broader audience, with more numerous audience. And hand in hand with them, we've developed these contents, identified lecturers, co-managed the participation, and developed our line of thinking. And today we're all here in focusing on the protected areas of the Amazon, wishing this cycle of webinars to every time more and more strengthen this learning community amongst each other and for others, and especially for the Amazon biome. I want to remind you that national parks is the focal point of the working group on governance. What this means is that in my case, I am representing, in the exercise we're carrying out, 6 different countries. We have with us Brazil. Currently, Lia Mendes is for the Ministry of the Environment as our representative. We have Bolivia, Cesar Altamirano. We have Ecuador with Carlos Mendes. Telma Paredes for the Ministry of the Environment and Water and Ecologic Transition of Ecuador. We have Isla Cortez, Marco Arenas from Sarconavi in Peru. And finally, Hilda Angel and Giancarlo Martinez from Imparques Venezuela. And again, on your behalf and at your availability, Claudia Nunez for the National Parks of Colombia. And thank you very much. See you along the way. Thank you very much, Claudia, for giving a little bit of a framework on the governance working group, who makes it up, and how this initiative was born. Oh, well, as we mentioned, on the issue of management and shared management and governance of the Amazon area, let me share the agenda. You'll be able to see what presentations we will have for you today. I think you can see it. So, today we will look at 3 cases of shared governance in protected areas in the Amazon Basin. To just give you a little bit of a framework, what happens in the creation of protected areas in our region, especially in the Amazon, but in the whole region, is that oftentimes the development of protected areas end up overlapping with territorial spaces that are already occupied by humans, either farmers' communities, riverside communities, indigenous people, or fishing communities. So there are some previous rights over these protected areas. And oftentimes, as the areas are created, these rights continue existing once the area is declared protected. So in this sense, there have been many different scenarios of envisioning new ways of managing the territories, because you see these overlaps between different protected areas and different communities, as we mentioned. In the Amazon, this is a stronger pattern, the overlap that exists among protected areas and territories with the presence of communities, of farmers or indigenous people. And therefore, there have been different structures and shared governance frameworks that allow managing these territories with the different visions, national, subnational states, and community organizations or territory-based organizations. So in this webinar, we will be sharing 3 cases from the Amazon. The first from Venezuela, with regards to the Canaima National Park, which will be presented by engineer Jacqueline Acosta from Imparques. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to achieve the connection. Are there any novelties that my colleagues can confirm? My colleague Domingo Castro from the Tamon people of the Venezuelan Amazon can mention, but because of connectivity problems, we haven't managed to have their presence today. The second case is on shared governance on Peru for the Maracaeri Reserve. It will be presented by the chief of the Service of the Parks of Peru. And the third case is the shared governance case between the National Natural Parks of Colombia and indigenous community in this park, Jaigogashe Apaporis. And we will hear from Edgar Castro, the director of the National Park. Then at the end, we will have a question and answer session and a few minutes to close the event. We wanted to mention we tried to do our best to also have among our lecturers and in our webinar, the idea was to have in all cases 2 lecturers. The reference from the national park system of each country and some leader of an indigenous community who's working actively in the governance process, but definitely the lack of equality as far as access to the internet and connectivity has made it this impossible. Until last night, we weren't able to confirm whether the person would have connection, but this morning we didn't manage to have connection with him. So we just wanted to mention why this is one of the main challenges that we face in managing these territories and having greater digital inclusion. It's all a very big challenge. So if it seems okay with you, Jacqueline, I don't know if you want to. Oh, we will be presenting 2 screens, right, Stanley? My understanding is that Stanley is going to share 2 screens. So if you give me just 1 second, I want to introduce Jacqueline Acosta. She's from Venezuela. She's an engineer for the environment and natural resources and current director of the National Parks Institute for the state of Bolívar. And she does the management of 2 national parks, the Canaima and Caora. She is currently working in this area since 2008. She started as a coordinator for the environmental parks. She's been a volunteer and an environmental specialist and coordination of the Canaima Park. And currently she's working in the administration of Imparques. So Jacqueline, let's open your mic and I'll let you know when you're about 5 minutes short. So you have about 20 minutes. Hello, Jacqueline. I just want to ask, we didn't manage to connect with Domingo, right? You're going to present on your own, right? Yes. Domingo is in the indigenous community of Camarata. Yesterday, he was not able to leave for Canaima. There were some problems with the flight, and I managed to speak with him over the phone this morning, but he does not have access to the internet in his community. So, well, we tried to unify criteria, and I will have to present without him, unfortunately. Thank you very much, Jacqueline. Thank you very much for these details. Okay, very well. Thank you very much. Good morning and hello to the whole team. Thank you for allowing us to present what we're currently doing to achieve this shared governance between indigenous community of the Basin town and, our guarantor institution of the administration and management of spaces. Currently, in the specific case of the Canay Park, Professor Stanley, next slide, please. And just very briefly, the framework of what we have at the Canaima National Park. It's a park that was decreed as such in the year 1962. We're close to it turning 60 as a national park. And it has a surface of 3 million hectares. It's pretty large. It's the 2nd largest park in the country, and it's among the largest in the world. Next slide. Due to this large territorial extension of this park, in order to facilitate its management, after decreeing its existence, we decided to divide the park in 2 sectors to facilitate its management. First, we decreed the eastern sector, which has an extension approximately of 1,100,000 hectares. And here we liquidated the largest sector, which is the Pemon number 5 indigenous sector, where we find colleagues from the indigenous people, but with the Taurepan dialect and Arecuna dialect. And with regards to this issue of the dialect, among the Pemon territory, we find basically several states within their same country, because we have Pemonta Maracoto, Pemon Maracuna, and Pemonta Orepanes. In the western sector of the park, which is what we know as the Great Meadows, we have the #2 indigenous territory, which has a soil use regulatory plan, which was decreed in the year 1991, which we're currently updating to be able to unify criteria so that we may have this organization plan and management plan to correspond with the national park. Then we also have the western sector, which is the case that we will be presenting today with the issue of governance, the western sector, which is almost 2 million hectares. And there we see the indigenous sector #2, which is the Pemonca Maracoto area. And here our colleague Domingo is the general captain. Fortunately, he was not able to connect. This sector is governed by a decree, specific decree, that corresponds, through which we manage all of the national parks and national monuments that don't have a soil use regulatory plan. Next slide, please. Approximately by the year 2018, with the arrival of our currently minister and the president of Imparques, and with the popular selection, was the general captain, for the first time since the park was decreed, a few have been already applied and a few have already been approved, and others are in progress. And we'll look at the challenges that we've had with the application of these mechanisms. And there are many mechanisms proposed by IAPA. We acknowledge the application of very similar mechanisms with regards to this. To, first of all, always respect the indigenous customs and acknowledging their rights, the rights of the Pemon people, which undoubtedly are the main stakeholders within the national park. They have been inhabiting these places for time immemorial, and before taking any decision, always, no decision is within the national park can be taken without having the approval or authorization both by the captains as well as the community itself. But as part of these mechanisms, we have the assemblies of the Pemon people in order to discuss the pros and cons of each one of the aspects that we want to develop within the national park. As far as decisions specifically and programs that we want to implement, each one of the aspects that we can establish within the national park is taken to a community assembly where the indigenous captain discusses the matter with the whole community. We also have the use of resources as part of the convention, which we will see later on, as far as carrying out programs that are participative. No decision, as I mentioned, no authorization that we could issue is done without the approval from the indigenous community as such. In fact, as part of our requirements in order to issue any kind of approval, there's always the fact that the user or the company or the natural person that requests the authorization needs to have an approval from the indigenous captainship. It's also applied with the organization of the application of the soil use regulations. All of these cases will be taken to public consultation with all stakeholders, mainly with the indigenous communities, and then with all of the stakeholders, whether these are local government, regional government, the ministries that participate in the national park. Each one of these stakeholders are involved in a public consultation process before we do a decrees, before we refer to the soil use regulation. We also have that our pilot program, we have macro agreements which we will see later on, which are the presentation letter, so to speak, that we have in how we're very close to achieving this shared governance that we have sought so hard. And finally, but not less important, we need to highlight that all of our park rangers and hello, Jacqueline, hello. Seems she might be having some type of problem. I think she lost connection. I don't know if it was my connection or her connection. Jacqueline, can you hear us? I will send her a message.
Ahí se silenció ese micrófono. Voy a ver si consigo conectar con ella.
I'll see if I can connect with her. And maybe we can resolve this quickly. Can you hear me? Oh, Jacqueline. Hello? Yes. Sorry. Can you hear me? Now we can. Go ahead. Sorry for the connection. No problem. Connection is a little weak here. Sorry. That's okay. So finally, I think I was left with the macro agreements side of thing. And the case that all of our staff working within the national parks, both the park rangers, the firefighters, technical staff, all comes from the indigenous people of the Pemon people. We brought support staff from outside, but the actual permanent staff is of the indigenous people of the Pemon people. And that is done as a way of acknowledging our indigenous brothers as the managers and main stakeholders in the management of their environment. Next one, please. Okay, what I mentioned just a few minutes ago, what we've done in this year, 2021, after almost 2-3 years of continuous work with the indigenous captainship of the Canaima community, with the general captainship of sector number 2, is establishing a macro agreement between the National Parks Institute and specifically the indigenous community of Canaima. This is where we located most of the soil use.
Donde tenemos también,
and where we have also the strongest tourist pressure, the strongest use of the resources. Just about 2 weeks ago, we were able to establish an agreement with the indigenous captain Roberto from the community of Canaima specifically, and always with the participation of Domingo, was the regional authority. This was discussed in numerous assemblies with the inhabitants of the indigenous community. It was discussed with the minister, with the president of Emparque, and all of the stakeholders who are directly linked to the application of this agreement. And after this, what were we seeking mainly? Well, an equivalent distribution of incoming resources, economic resources. When we go into the park, the user has to pay a fee. These resources are distributed between Imparques and the indigenous community. There's also access to the resources depending on all of the concessions and services from the National Park Institute to tourist operators or tourist companies, where there's a distribution of these resources. And anything that generates resources, authorizations, etc., there will always be a distribution with the indigenous community of their economic resources. And as we can see here, to educate the indigenous communities and within the cultural practices, and always respecting their ancestral culture of our brothers and sisters. This as far as the management of economic resources as such. Aside from this, we also establish clauses on how we're going to co-manage these spaces, depending whether it's with excursions or whether it's the different modes of applying tourist practices or ecotourist practices in this case. Jacqueline?
Hola, hola.
Hello?
Jacqueline, creo que perdimos conexión nuevamente.
Jacqueline, I think we lost connection with you again.
Hola.
Hello?
Jacqueline, ¿nos escucha?
Jacqueline, can you hear me? Our internet seems to be unstable. Yeah, we have been told that. Yesterday, she was having a lot of connectivity problems. I don't think it's something that can be solved, but maybe we can start preparing.
Aquí estoy, ¿me escuchan otra vez?
Here I am. Can you hear me?
Vamos, tranquila, seguimos, no te preocupes.
It's okay, no problem. Let's go on. We have only 6 minutes left. Thank you.
Perfecto, gracias. Bueno,
Well, and this co-handling of the spaces that we are currently working on, always trying to minimize environmental impact and trying to mitigate the impact that we've already seen. But this is what this agreement is based on, this macro agreement that has been established with the indigenous community, which we hope is going to be a pilot for all indigenous communities that we have inside the national park. We are talking, including the western and eastern sectors, about 4 communities, and the flag will be the good use of those natural spaces for tourism activities that are going to generate income for this indigenous community, but also that will ensure Sorry, we lost the sound again.
Hola, hola. Hola, Jacqueline.
Jacqueline, are you still with us?
Hola. ¿Nos escuchas?
¿me escuchan?
Ahí sí.
Ok. ¿Me escuchan aquí?
Sí, adelante.
Yes, please go ahead. So we're looking for ways to try and implement actions that are going to ensure an economic income, but also the sustainability of this space. And this environmental management needs to be sustainable to ensure the conservation of the area. And here we can see some of the actions that we've taken together. Our park rangers, mostly on the western sector in Canaima and Camarata. We have park rangers that are indigenous from the Pemon community. And what we are trying to do is to strengthen the tourism activity inside these spaces as the main activity that can represent an income for this community, but also with the practices that are environmentally friendly. We have to face some challenges or aspects
En la medida del tiempo.
that we are trying to adapt to as time goes by. And in general, we have discrepancies. And I think that this is normal because we have different cultures, but we have learned to respect each other. And those discrepancies in decision making has been minimized. So at least we are now able to listen to each other, and we have constructive criticism, because at the end, this is going to be a challenge for both parties. So it's been 3 long years now, but the results have been very positive. And another challenge is that sometimes we have delays when it comes to decision making, because assemblies or meetings sometimes take too long, or sometimes it's not just one single meeting, but a few, and some sessions are going to take longer than others. But this is what we are trying to work on, to find a common ground in order for these decisions to be made as quickly as needed. And our biggest challenge at Canaima is the mining, because we are constantly fighting. And Captain Domingo has been doing a wonderful work to take these people out of this mining activity. And this is why we want to strengthen the tourism activity, because this is going to be a generation of income with no need for these people to go into the mining activity. And for the first time, we have been able to unify our criteria, and we are constantly fighting mining within the park. And this also results in a conflict of interest, because it's not easy to find economic resources, but this is something that we're currently working on. And also trying to apply these all the practices that our grandparents had, in order to make this a sustainable management of the space. And we are also working on updating our legislation for the use of soil and space, and also a macro law, which is a decree for the handling of the whole system of national parks throughout the country. Well, it has been brief, but I hope that this met your expectations, because we are still learning. There is something new to learn every day. And this is where we are now, and we are about to be able to have that governance that we've worked so hard for. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Jacqueline. And thank you for sharing your experience in spite of all the challenges that we know you have to face. And well, Domingo had no connection, so we couldn't have him, but thank you for covering. And it's been nice to learn about your experience in such a mythical place in Latin America. So we'll like to ask our colleagues from Peru to start the screen sharing. And can you let me know if you can see my screen? Yes, it's been, yes, we can hear you and we see your screen. Just give me a second to introduce you. And then the floor will be yours. He's an agronomist with over 20 years experience in climate change and sustainable development, with over 15 diplomas in environmental management and a wide experience in the forest, and 10 years working in protected areas, and 4.5 years as a head of the community reserve Amaracaeri, which you will be sharing with us today, all the way from Peru. Thank you, Asbin, for your time and for being here with us. And you have 20 minutes. I will let you know when you have only 5 minutes left. Thank you. We cannot hear you. Your phone is muted. I apologize. Well, thank you, everyone. And once again, good morning. It is a pleasure to be able to represent this service of protected areas. And greetings from our regional director, Mr. Gamboa, and Jose Carlos Nieto. And the apologies from the president of Camaracay, because he cannot be here with us. The idea was to share this presentation, but he couldn't be here. Just give me a second, please, because I'm having some technical difficulties. Well, about this community reserve, Amaracaeri is a protected natural area that was established back in 2002 with over 400,000 hectares and almost 500 kilometers in the front. Our reserves are a very special protected areas because they are co-managed with the communities, and the creation is due to a request on behalf of the native communities and we have 3 indigenous communities, Carato, Guinea, Machigenga, and they have 10 communities around our community reserve, 9 in this area and 1 in Cusco. And the idea is to contribute to the protection of the basin of the rivers Madre de Dios and Colorado, and to ensure the stability of the land and forests in order to have the good drinking water. And let me talk to you about co-management. As I said, this is the way in which we handled these areas. Indigenous communities are the ones that requested the creation of this protected area, are represented by an executor of the management agreement. In this case, the Peruvian government is represented by the National Service of Protected Areas, and together we manage this community reserve, and also with the help of a group of volunteers, which is the management committee that also helps us to manage this project. And this co-management is based on some principles that I would say are basic for the work that we carry out, which are trust, transparency, and equal conditions. How long are we going to manage the natural protected areas on behalf of indigenous communities? Whether it's indefinite because it's a permanent contract with the government, and this is the co-management together with the National Service of Protected Areas. For the case of ECA RCA, we have 21 obligations that we share with Suriname for the National Service of Protected Areas, and 9 which are our own. And what are the obligations or duties that we share? Well, the management of this community reserve according to the master plan, and also other documents that we use for management purposes. And we want to lead the preparation of the master plan, the surveillance plan, annual plans for management, and other management tools. And which are the 4 duties on behalf of the government? Well, the management, granting of rights, control actions, and sanctions. To give you an idea of the structure of this co-management, we have 5 main items that are related to the environmental aspects, economic, social, cultural, and management aspects. And on each of these areas or items, we have a director on behalf of the Maricari area who coordinates with a specialist from the National Service. And as you can see, in environmental area, we have monitoring, surveillance, social and environmental research. And then as for the economic aspect, we have resource management and social participative management, cultural, well, of course, the cultural area, and as for management organization. As for the management tools, we have a special regime, which is a specific document for the management of natural protected areas or community reserves, and we have a management agreement, as I said. We also have a master plan, which is a plan and document, and it is the most important for the protected national area. And we also have an institutional life plan, and we also have a financial sustainability strategy. And we also have plans for a plentiful life And this is very important because we are working on these areas, but we want to generate more development for the people that lives near these areas. And in addition, these plans for a fulfilling life are also something that we work on along with the municipalities, and we are currently in the process of recognizing a regional government. Our plans, as I just said, are based on conservation agreements, which I will explain in just a few minutes. And we have like this umbrella that covers all these natural protected areas. And we have a master plan for the National Service for Protected Areas. So in this case, why do we need this conservation agreement? In order to strengthen co-management and participative management, and to implement activities of the master plan and life plans of our partners. And these agreements are trying to make more explicit and establish, on one hand, the conservation commitments and sustainable use that is expected from each of our partner communities in relation to the objectives of their own life plans and the master plan for the protected area. As I just said, this is something that is linked, and also a commitment on behalf of the ECA to manage the support that each community needs in order to meet their development goals. And the agreements in this case can be used as guidance in order to find the implementation for strategic actions in order to ensure good governance on territorial management in the framework of this agreement. And the general objective is to strengthen the relation of the executive of this administration agreement of the community reserve Armaracaeri with the native partners, and also by complying with the RCA administration agreement and the head of this reserve, and in this case I represent it, by establishing mechanisms for the coordination and participation of an effective co-management for the areas. Then these are some of the specific objectives that are linked to the establishment and implementation of agreements with the partner communities, about opportunities for alliances and incentives, and to promote implementation of the master plan of the community reserve and the lifeline of the native communities in the frame of a consolidation of this co-management model for community reserves, and to promote implementation of RED of the Amazon indigenous communities. And this is the pilot area, we could say, for Peru and also for COICA, and all of these as part of the nationally determined contributions. These are some of the tripartite commitments of the environmental component. If we take one of the components of these agreements and take it to the communities, in this case, we would like to inform about the third parties that are participating in illegal activities, and we have these early warnings, and we have community surveillance for a period of 2 years, and they work together with the park rangers, and they are patrolling all these areas on sectors that are being threatened, and they also facilitate lodging for these surveillance teams during the patrol activities, and also they have an agreement for the use of vehicles and equipment, and they also raise awareness on the authorities of how important the RCA is for the communities during these community activities or working with other authorities. And we also have the verification of these early warnings of geobosques, which is a space of the Peruvian government that send us some alerts when we have deforestation. And as you can see, each community, in this case, this is an example of the native community of Puerto Luz, and as you can see, they monitor this space of what we call grillas, or these small spaces that we develop. So depending on the area, they are going to have different tasks assigned to them. In this case, for Amaracaire, we have 100 hectares for each of these grids, and they have a very extensive area for surveillance of this sector, and this is going to help with the management of the natural protected area. This is another case for the community of Queros, and as you can see, we have to the left a community, and they have inside a number of grids, or this is how we call them. That includes the commitments when it comes to the surveillance of the areas. And
Retorno, por favor. Bueno, como les mencionaba, en el caso del ECA Maracaire tiene algunos compromisos y dentro de estos está gestionar la dotación de víveres y seguros para los vigilantes, la capacitación a los vigilantes comunales, gestionar la implementación de equipos de campo y seguridad, movilidad logística, etcétera, para los vigilantes comunales, gestionar y monitorear la operatividad de los vigilantes comunales, gestionar la elaboración de un protocolo conjunto de vigilancia con el Programa Nacional de Conservación de Bosques y Mitigación para el Cambio Climático, en este caso para las transferencias directas condicionadas, que es una forma de apoyo del gobierno peruano a las comunidades para que ellos también puedan entrar en el tema de conservación. También sensibilizar a las autoridades en el ámbito de la Reserva Comunal Amaracaire de la importancia de ella y también la importancia que tiene para las comunidades. Trabajar de manera conjunta con las autoridades, en este caso la autoridad forestal, en las acciones de vigilancia y control para frenar, por ejemplo, la extracción ilegal de especies forestales, informar a las asambleas comunales de los resultados de las acciones de vigilancia y control, promover el monitoreo con diferentes equipos que estamos trabajando ahora. Nosotros estamos trabajando ya con drones, por ejemplo, y con algunos sistemas que los podemos trabajar en teléfonos celulares o en tablets, con los cuales vamos grabando la información que nosotros tenemos en campo. En este caso, el ECA Maracaire ha implementado el mapeo móvil y el mapeo desktop, que es un sistema muy interesante para poder monitorear el área, y mejorar la administración de algunos equipos, ¿no? La devolución de equipos. En el caso de la jefatura, igual, tenemos diferentes compromisos, como los pueden ver. Voy a tratar de acelerar un poquito porque es muy poco el tiempo, lamentablemente, de 20 minutos para todo lo que hacemos. Bueno, algunos logros que hemos tenido en los últimos años en la Reserva Comunal. Por ejemplo, aquí ustedes pueden ver de que nuestras comunidades tienen los, los planes de vida, ¿no? Entonces nuestras 10 comunidades tienen planes de vida, 9 que se han trabajado con el ejecutor de contrato de administración y una con la Federación Indígena, en este caso la FENAMAT. Estas son nuestras 10 comunidades, como ven, están alrededor del área natural protegida. En este caso, se muestra el mapa de comunidades nativas con transferencias directas condicionadas. Son 6 de nuestras comunidades socias con 118.386 hectáreas conservadas, más de 1 millón de soles, en este caso, que se ha transferido ya a las comunidades por este tema. Aquí muestro un poco de algunos proyectos y diferentes logros que hemos tenido con los acuerdos de conservación. Entonces, por ejemplo, con el proyecto de Amazonía Resiliente del PNUD se ha logrado un microgrant de $130.000 que asegura el desarrollo de programas de actividades económicas sostenibles, le llamamos así, que no es otra cosa que unos espacios en los cuales se generan actividades económicas desde las comunidades nativas que son financiadas con un capital semilla desde la cogestión. En este caso, nosotros hemos tenido también 10 PAEs para las comunidades nativas que se hizo anteriormente con el proyecto de Amazonía. Hemos logrado ejecutar dentro de estas actividades económicas sostenibles ya 25 PAEs. Tenemos 836 familias beneficiarias dentro de nuestras 10 comunidades nativas. Tenemos 12 acuerdos de conservación No solamente los acuerdos con nuestras comunidades nativas, sino ya estamos entrando en acuerdos con algunos grupos de gente colona que está también alrededor del área natural protegida. Tenemos 10 comunidades nativas y 2 familias, en este caso beneficiarias.
¿Asvin?
Sí, perdón. Con
Perdón la interrupción, quedan 5
146.300
minutitos.
hectáreas. Perdón, sí, gracias. Bueno, en este caso les estoy mostrando el caso de los fondos concursables, de diferentes fondos concursables que hemos ido logrando desde la Reserva Comunal Amaracaire, desde la cogestión. Como pueden ver, hay mucho dinero que se ha ido gestionando desde la cogestión para el beneficio de nuestras comunidades nativas. Aquí les muestro un poco de algunos otros fondos concursables que también se han logrado. Es mucho dinero, como les digo, que se está gestionando para el desarrollo de las comunidades nativas, con el beneficio económico, obviamente, para ellas. Voy a hablarles de algunos retos que nosotros tenemos como cogestión en esto. Es conectar y lograr el desarrollo con la conservación, porque no puede haber conservación de un área natural protegida sin enfocarse al desarrollo de las poblaciones, porque obviamente ¿para quién se conserva? Se conserva para la gente. Entonces, este es un reto que seguimos impulsando desde la cogestión. También está el impulsar nuevas prioridades, enfoques para incluir temas de gobernanza con participación, inclusión social, concertación de intereses y distribución equitativa de beneficios económicos de la conservación, el gestionar y conservar productivamente la diversidad biológica más allá de nuestras fronteras de las áreas protegidas, como les decía, el desarrollo con áreas naturales protegidas, que es un tema importantísimo para nosotros. Otros retos que tenemos es mantener o subir el estado de conservación de 98.51%, 55% en este momento, la lucha contra las actividades ilegales en la zona de amortiguamiento y las que se podrían presentar al interior del área natural protegida, dañando la integridad justamente de la misma. Como ven aquí, por ejemplo, hay 2 casos.
And as you can see, we have 2 clear cases of illegal activities that we currently conduct on this buffer area, one of the upper area and on the lower part.
Cultivos ilegales, coca, ¿no? Obviamente con fines de narcotráfico. Bueno, y he tratado un poquito de acelerar, hay muchas cosas más que yo les quisiera compartir. Por ejemplo, nosotros en este momento somos parte de la lista verde de la UICN. Esto demuestra que justamente la Reserva Comunal es una de las áreas top, podríamos decir, para la conservación de las áreas protegidas en el mundo. Esto nos reconoce justamente una buena gobernanza en el área natural protegida. Hemos tenido también el premio ecuatorial a la gobernanza del área natural protegida, que también hemos tenido un premio. Y bueno, hay muchas cosas más de las que yo les quisiera hablar, pero como les decía, 20 minutos a veces para todo lo que tenemos en la Reserva Comunal es bastante corto. Yo les agradezco mucho por este espacio.
Gracias, Asvin.
Thank you. We know that it's not easy to mention everything with so many things that you're currently working on and so many stakeholders. And I know that you're a point of reference in the region. So I congratulate you for these activities. So once again, thank you for taking the time to participate in this webinar. Thank you for this space that is allowing us to share what we do in the management of these protected areas in Peru. Well, thank you. It has been really interesting to get to know how much you have been able to advance.
Es que alguien los está silenciando.
Ok.
Gracias.
Gracias por el comentario, Bernardo. Entonces,
Well, thank you, Bernardo. We need to pay attention because someone is muting the interpreters. So, Edgar, I don't know if you are here. Would you like to screen share with us?
Entonces, mientras se carga la pantalla,
Well, while we wait,
para presentar a
I'll
Edgar, que es el
introduce Edgar Castro,
director
Director of the National Park of Yaigojea-Paporis, and part of the National Service for the protected areas from the University of International Cooperation, and the head of the area, as I said, and his profile and experience is related to being responsible of these protected areas that overlap some indigenous communities in the Amazon, with a wide experience working on territorial governance with emphasis in environmental and cultural aspects, the facilitation for the construction, definition, and implementation of these types of agreements for the management of these conservation areas. For 18 years, he has been a member of the steering committee of the National Park of Yaugojea-Paporis and other areas. So thank you for your time, for being here with us. And you can, in a coordination, we can, I'm sorry, someone had an open microphone. I don't know if you can hear me.
Hubo un tema ahí con el audio.
There's an issue with the audio. Yeah, fine. Okay, so 20 minutes. When we're 15 minutes in, I will interrupt you just to remind you that you're about to finish your time. Okay, greetings to all of our brothers and sisters in Latin America, the colleagues from the protected areas. We've seen each other at different forums and environments. Honestly, I just wanted to thank the Professor Stanley for the invitation. And well, I'm going to share the experience as a model or mechanism that we have in Colombia, which are the special regimes for management, in the case specifically of the Yapaporis National Park. And very well, I take this experience. I was asked to discuss this more as a manager or chief of the protected area. So I hope that the elements that I bring forth here are what was sought for this environment. I will speak based on the experience of a few elements highlighted in this governance mechanism and the experiences, lessons learned. Very well, here in starting these reflections, I wanted to share a map that was developed by the indigenous people in Paporis and Rio Pira, which are part of their endogenous investigation research process. As we can see here, we can look at the whole Amazon basin, but even the Orinoco basin. And we can even include Canaimas here. What this map wants to show is that the indigenous world has other ways of looking at the territory. And this is key for them. These barriers that we have don't exist. And this is key when we're trying to understand and also supports in their joint efforts with them. One of the reflections here is that this presentation and the whole work that we've done in Apaporis is focused on the indigenous communities and territories. A few left because of COVID. The colleagues from national parks also. Another element here in this reflection is that the Amazon cultures conceive the world differently, even though nowadays they use the internet and manufacture clothing, etc. They still have a different vision and outlook on the world. Another issue is that the protection of the territories in an ancestral manner links to this issue of the protected areas, not just in the framework of the Americas but at the world level as such. And the other point of reflection is that there's a certain level of connectivity that is not just ecological, it's also cultural and social, and goes beyond the bird borders that we normally envision. And the other issue is that there must be a respect and an acknowledgement of the cultural diversity and of the knowledge systems that we see here. I think that Christina told us that there were different peoples, communities, and they all have their own knowledge system. And it's very important today to acknowledge that there are different ways of seeing the world and of accessing knowledge. A part of this framework is that, at least in Colombia's case, we for several years already have envisioned the issue that our areas are in an overlap. And so we propose that overlaps, more than being just a mere problem, they can be an opportunity and a challenge. In the case of Colombia, the indigenous authorities are of a public nature, meaning that they're not just social stakeholders, but also political stakeholders backed by a special indigenous forum that is established by our constitution. This whole issue of these shared mechanisms, of these special management regimes, have had a long pathway where having policies at the national level has been key for the defense and the protection of indigenous territories, but also in the national parks policies that for us are known as the social participation policy and conservation. In the case of the Amazon Basin, we also develop guidelines and focuses to work in overlap areas. And in this experience, in the lower part of the screen, you will see the three symbols for the representatives of the stakeholders involved. The tiger represent the authority of the indigenous people of the Ayapaporis. There's also an O, which represents the other association of authorities, and the national park symbol. The framework, just very quickly, of this park, it's located in the northwestern Amazon area, in the Opeyamas Department of Colombia. It has more than 1 million hectares. It also is part of what the indigenous call the macro territory, which is where their ancestral management overlaps with the protected area. There are several ancestral territories and 21 indigenous communities. The park completely overlaps indigenous territories and areas, and it's category 2 among the categories of the national park. Well, there's a few elements here which I think are important to present as part of this mechanism. One is the definition of focuses and guidelines in overlap areas. This has been developed for a few years already. Here in the national park system, the development of the protected area is one very strong element, because the initiative of this park is born from the indigenous authorities and areas. For their development, a previous consultation process was done, which looked at the formulation of 13 different points, which are currently present. And let's say that in this creation, we define jointly the conservation objectives of the protected area. These objectives have been, say, worked on based on the intercultural dialogue with the traditional authorities and peoples of the Yapaporis area. And let's say that they have elements and attributes that are not just the protection of biodiversity, but also of cultural diversity and of the uses and cultural practices of the Yapaporis people. This regime also involves dialogue and endogenous investigation and research. The communities and people for more than 5 years were developing a research process that highlighted products that were the foundation for the special management. It's worth highlighting here that here in this construction, there is also a fundamental element, which is defining the reason for being. Here, the issue of conservation is a construction, but it's a construction that involves different ways of thinking. And this was a challenge to come to an agreement on what we're going to protect. And so these goals have been a reference at the level of the Amazon framework, at the international level, and especially based on the vision. Another element is the implementation of this regime. Currently, it's being implemented. There are some, and this is a mechanism through which the development of actions, strategies, and results is carried through year after year in order to achieve the implementation of this mechanism. And here, delving into the topic that the professor asked me, these are the experience processes. I've been lucky to be a part of this whole process, and these are some of the experiences that are fundamental in order to maintain the linking processes. These in time have been consolidated. There's respect, trust, transparency, communication, interculturality, collaboration, and reciprocity. But this has to be done based on leading by example. And this has its own complexities because obviously it's not just a matter of representing an institution, but you're also a person. And so it has its own complex nature. The other element of the experience that I did not highlight, which is key, is fostering intercultural dialogue. And you say, well, how do you do this? Well, by understanding that here you need to develop based on two ways of thinking that are really different. We have one way, and the indigenous world has a different way of looking at things. So all of this is key. And for this purpose, you also need physical contact and communication with the communities and authorities. So here in an area like this, in one of these mechanisms, for example, the control remote of a chief or somebody who's not in the area, that doesn't work well. So here, the manager is key to be closely linked with the community itself. And this is highly complex in many fields because the manager must not only be within the area, but also work on other management aspects. And that is the challenge of this mechanism in this area. You need to facilitate the communication between these relations are a marriage, but they're a marriage where there's always different parts involved. So the manager plays often the role of being the liaison between the institution and also the indigenous communities. This presents some challenges when there are changes in staff or changes in the institution or changes in the policies, and this definitely impacts that relationship. Knowing the political framework and the social framework of the territory and the coordination process is key in these mechanisms. To say that when somebody new comes into these processes, you need to be certain that this person has an induction process that really focuses on what being in these territories means. And here I will speak a little bit of the establishing of agreements and formalization. As I mentioned, this is like a marriage, right? And you know that marriages have some wonderful things, but they also have their challenges, which is why it's important for the marriage to be formalized, to have some principles, some clear rules, the role of each, the independent duties. It involves teamwork, but also shared responsibilities from each party. Let's say that in every marriage, there are some problems, and it's necessary to have the mechanisms that can allow resolving these difficulties, not just in an immediate manner, but through time. And so what we've seen here is that there's no secret recipe for this. You actually need to innovate, and you actually try new things, because this is a very specific and unique type of marriage. And oftentimes it has its exceptional features, which is why it's important to turn to these innovative ideas. There's another key component here that I've experienced, and is that institutional timeframes are faster than, yes? You have 5 minutes left. These institutional timeframes are very different. On the local side, the local communities use a different type of time. And there's an important phrase that they use is, don't push me, I can follow my own. And this highlights the fact that you cannot run or rush things because of institutional demands. There is a whole issue that, in theory, many of the strategic elements have certain specific time frames, but when we're talking about shared mechanisms, dynamics run at a different time. There's a technical and emotional teardown in establishing certain agreements, and this also requires special remunerations, but not necessarily economic, but other forms, so that they may continue forward with the processes. The management of resources for the implementation of these mechanisms oftentimes involve running against the clock, or there's competences with other areas, other colleagues, allies. Oftentimes we say we're not aligned, meaning the regulation of external interests can be highly complex. And let's say that that is an experience that we need to pay attention to. Also, the pulses of the river are part of the vital mechanisms. Symbolism as part of the driving force of the territory. And the processes have to be seen as an experience of life. Dances are seen as a symptom of the health of the park itself. The maintenance of the knowledge system is an indicator for the territory. They are key in managing adaptation. The need to qualify and update the work teams of yourself, of the people who work there. one thing that is important is that products on paper are not the same as products in real life or the positive impact that they can have in the communities. In our case, or my case, both things are important. We say that nobody is essential in these processes, but it's very important to work as a team. We need to acknowledge that there are different knowledge systems, protected areas in their definition, in their goals for conservation, must be carried out from a focus that guarantees the participation in every process and foster intercultural dialogue. It's important to define and formalize and implement political agreements for management. The definition of implementation has required institutional collaboration, and definitely all of these mechanisms do require institutions to adapt, because this has certain legal and political and technical aspects that require it. There are no special recipes. They require information for decision making as an intercultural focus and participative focus. The pulses of the river are indicators that need to be kept in mind for the management. And all of this requires the appropriate special environment, intercultural dialogue, respect for the culture and government, and the duty of the parks, to have staff that really likes the work, that has knowledge of the protected areas and the indigenous territories. Here, there are some challenges in the case of this mechanism. In these processes, we need to have regulatory systems that are effective for the control of actions that are not allowed by the indigenous people in their territory or the area of influence, to have effective, sustainable mechanism for the financing of the system at the short, mid, and long term, to allow the implementation of the network and compliance with the agreements, to make progress in establishing administrative procedures that are more aligned with the implementation of a REN, taking into account the geographic and political aspects of the territory, to achieve the implementation of joint efforts focused on knowing the status of the conservation and the priorities of conservation, to maintain the communication of exercise in challenging areas, such as political environments, institutional environments, the pandemic, and the effects of climate change. An exercise of coordination of how to achieve autonomy based on traditional community-based areas in the management and structuring of the park. These are kind of the elements of the experience, but let's say that by hearing to the colleague from Canaima, you can say that as part of all of these challenges, you may believe that you are the only person that faces these challenges and problems. But at the end of the day, in all of these frameworks, there's always problems that are shared, but just as there are problems, there are also pathways that others have followed and which are a sort of light for working and making progress with these mechanisms. And in closing, it's important the knowledge that these communities, local communities, have in the management of the territories and in protected areas is key. There's a complement, and the other part is that conservation nowadays requires focuses that are more complementary with these systems of knowledge that the people have. So I would think that these are some of the key components, and that definitely without agreements, both political and management agreement, it's impossible to achieve this. And as mentioned by our colleague in Peru, this also needs to be harmonized with the development or conservation or management for these mechanisms. That would be it. Thank you. Thank you very much, Edgar. Thank you very much for the presentation, for bringing us a little bit of this reality of the Colombian Amazon. Thank you very much to our three lecturers, Edgar, Jacqueline. It's interesting to know these experiences firsthand from the Amazon to the rest of Latin America. So now we have just a little bit more than half an hour left. Please, the people who connect, please mute your microphone. People who are joining the session, please mute your microphone. So I wanted to say, now we're going to start a round of questions and answers. Whoever has questions, please ask them via the chat and point out which lecturer they are for. And this last part of the webinar will be moderated by Stanley. There will be a first round of Stanley. I grant the word to you. Thank you, Christina. I wanted to congratulate and thank once again Jacqueline for telling us a little bit about this process to achieve this shared governance. Our friend Asbin from Peru, who tell us how this consolidated mechanism in Peru can be applied to the communal reserves, executing administration and management contracts, who co-manage the protected areas. And finally, our friend Edgar, always passionate about the indigenous topic, telling us of a few emblematic cases in Colombia in the creation of this park developed by request of the indigenous communities and managed jointly. Edgar, could you stop sharing your screen, please? So that we can see. That's it. Thank you, Edgar. Before we grant the word to the rest of participants, I wanted to ask all three lecturers to mention three topics, but just a minute and a half per topic. Just very specific data and information, highly specific, highly focused. Three topics that generally experience tell us that they kind of become a sort of barrier that prevents or hinder or prevents some systems or managers of protected areas to make progress towards this shared governance. The first is that, as Edward said, this marriage always requires a lot of effort. It requires a lot of energy, emotional energy, institutional effort to achieve these things. I once was told by a manager, to me, it's not very clear what we gain from all of this or what the communities gain from all of this by making progress on these mechanisms through these expensive and complex mechanisms. So for all three lecturers, the first point would be, tell us very quickly, what is the added value that you see in participating in this shared knowledge with everything that it entails as far as energy, resources, and things to be applied? That's one side of the question. And the other side is, how do you measure achieving that added value? How does Asbin knows that so many years devoted to this process will generate a profit or a benefit? How do you measure this? And this, on the other side, Jacqueline, whatever you can measure. And the other topic is people say that this is very expensive, that we need to mobilize the communities and it's very expensive. And obviously it is. So how do you finance these processes? Who places this money? The state, international cooperation, the communities, everyone who's financing these processes. This is a difficulty for many people. And people say, oh, well, we don't have money to do this, to finance transfers, activities, etc. Financing. Second topic. And the third topic, some people say, what we do is we reignite conflicts. People come and demand things that we can't give. We tell people that they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And what we do is we start a bunch of conflicts and meetings are highly conflicted. Obviously, there are differences. How do you manage those differences to prevent them from becoming conflicts? How have you managed to handle those differences and manage this? Jacqueline mentioned that as part of their challenges, that one of the topics was to achieve those agreements.
Lo están logrando y qué tan difícil es eso.
How are you doing this and how difficult it is? 3 topics, and you're going to have 3 or 4 minutes with precise information, value added. How do you measure it? How do you finance it? And how do you handle conflict? Jacqueline, would you like to start? Thank you, Professor. Well, as for the first topic, can you hear me fine? Yes, go ahead. Well, in relation to this value added and how we measure the success that we've had throughout the years, well, we've gone from the time when we were not even allowed to participate in meetings and to the present time where we sit with them and we share with them. So there's been a change in this paradigm that we had regarding our discussion, because now we became an institution that is going to guarantee to look for alternatives and common ground to be able to implement all the actions that we have for the management of the protected area. And being able to participate on these meetings of this PEMON population, well, it's not as easy to establish this dialogue with them and with the council of the ancient people regarding the authorities of each of the communities. So we have measured our project as very successful. And that idea of sharing with them has strengthened their culture, and we've been able to attain our main goal, that is the conservation of these spaces. And beyond the economic aspect, I can ensure the sustainability of the area. And this is how we measure that now we are able to share with them. They listen to us and we provide guidance to them regarding the decision making. We've been advising them regarding decision making in different topics in the national park, and this is the reason why we've been very successful. There's still a lot that we can do, but we are headed in the right direction, because now together with these indigenous communities, we can look for the best alternatives and always contributing to a win-win situation. And how do you finance it? Well, we have so many stakeholders that it's hard to participate on everything, because access to this community is only by air. There's no land access. only by plane, so this complicates things. But sometimes the local government or the state governance and maybe the institute or the ministry or the indigenous communities with the resources that they get from the national park, we have different means, and it's not as continuous as we would like it to be, but we have all the time a stakeholder that can finance a transportation or a stay there, and also tourist operators that have camps inside a national park. So we all contribute in order to be able to keep on working on this management and to be present with this indigenous community to be able to make the best decisions possible. And as for conflict, what about conflict? Have you had conflicts, or how do you handle them? Well,
Lo mejor que hemos podido,
the best option that we've had to try and prevent conflict or face conflict is to learn to listen. We must understand that culture because it is not so difficult than ours. So, and what's crucial is to have empathy and not to see them as something, not look down on them, because we are on the same side, and that has helped a lot. So beyond seeing ourselves as the authority, we have many similarities with them and with the communities beyond these, I don't know, this captainship. So we need to have this empathy and to learn how to listen to them. I think that we lost the sound again. Well, so I think that Jacqueline's ideas are clear. Asbin, how about you? Of course, for us at CERNAM, as I said during my presentation, we have this idea of creating development for this protected area. So one of the ways in which we measure how effective we are is with the percentage that we have when we are measured from the headquarters, and that is going to tell how effective our management has been for the conservation of the area. And something that is really important regarding how we measure this development that is generated by this co-management is how much money, as I showed you in one of my slides, that we have been managing in order to conduct sustainable economic activities to the benefit of this foundation. So we have a lot of money, I would say hundreds of thousands of soles or even dollars that we are currently managing to try and look and promote the development of these populations. So we are already scaling higher levels because, as I already said, our participation is with a seed capital, and in many cases on these communities have already scaling higher levels. So let's say that we had $10,000 to a community for this entrepreneurship or this, I don't know, a sustainable activity. And with that foundation, we have, I don't know, projects with 230,000 soles, which is approximately $100,000. So what I mean is that we measure the conservation in the area and also the development and the projects that we have been working on jointly with the supervision of the executor of this administration agreement and, of course, the natural protected area. And this has leveraged big amounts of money for these populations that are going to be the eyes for this surveillance and are going to help with the control activity as well. Well, that is for the first question. And how do we finance these processes? Well, that's quite important. The executor of the administration agreement or this framework needs to get this budget or financing. They need to do it, and they are doing it in different manners. even though the Peruvian government contributes with money for the works that we conduct in the area of public servants. Well, we have the park rangers and so on, but the executor of the agreement has these community people and these caretakers, and we have international cooperation with some projects that are taken care of by this executor. And it's curious how we have some special patrol in which we needed the money because we received an alert. So for an illegal activity, for example, and oftentimes it is the executor of the agreement who finances all of these activities because as you can understand, we have, I don't know, we need activities in order to get the money and it's not as fast. But when it comes to this, the executor of this agreement has the financing or all the funds that they have been able to gather. Now they will have the money to conduct these surveillance and control activities right away. So they're highly efficient. And this executor, when it comes to economic sustainability and financial sustainability that they need for the future, they are now working on the creation of a company that is going to be in charge of all the activities that are the result of the economic activities in the communities. And it's going to be like a support for these communities when it comes to different topics. And also we have a small percentage for the sustainability of the actions that they are working on. So it's really important when it comes to the economic sustainability for what they are currently working on. And the third question that Stanley said is conflict. Well, of course, we'll always have to face a conflict, and specifically for us, a key element is this intercultural aspect. And also, our colleague from Venezuela also mentioned this, but for us, as I explained during my first slides, we have this co-management that is based on trust. So we need to be clear about things. So if we do things in a clear manner and we're transparent and we are open regarding how we manage things, I think that this is definitely key in order to prevent conflict. And also important, and which is something that we have been handling as well, is the fact that we must respect each other as equals, and the executor of this the agreement no longer works or like it did, or we still have some institutions that have already understood that they have a technical role, and this is the reason why they always say that they are no longer making claim, but they are presenting proposals, and then they move on to take action. So action allows precisely for the generation of projects and looking for partners or allies and all of this is going to allow for this co-management of this Amaracaire National Reserve, and this is why it is efficient. Thank you. Yeah, very interesting. That last point that you mentioned, those elements, the agreements are going to change the role of communities so that they can become part of this management. So they're no longer making claims of these management aspects because now they are promoting solutions. Very interesting. Edgar? Yes, I'm ready. Well, you were talking about benefits, and I think that in general, I think that these mechanisms that are shared have this advantage or virtue, and it is that in practice, we apply these principles of this biodiversity agreement, and it's important to have efficient participation in decision-making processes for these protected areas or conservation on behalf of locals. And in our case, it's the authorities. And I think that this benefit us, and also fundamental is to have the distribution of those resources. I would say when it comes to conservation, because I believe that this is a key aspect, and also in the Colombian case, as part of our constitution, we have many different things, but we also have other mechanisms that we do apply. For example, a coordination, I think, that enables the application or development of the social rights, and that is fundamental in Colombia. The rule of law, of course, applies, even though we have differences and we need to work with different cultures and so on. But I think that all these elements are going to be key when it comes to the benefits. And definitely, in our case, we have this double protection, because if this park protects the soil, we have another protection from the management of the indigenous communities, and this results in the work that we currently are dedicated to, but jointly. So I would say that when it comes to your second questions, how do we measure our success? We have a tool to measure the effectiveness, and it has been consolidated to have, I don't know, indicators and variables that will measure mechanisms like the one we have at Yasoja Vapores. And this tool measures the effectiveness at different times of the process in the short, medium, and long term. But it does measure how we exercise this coordination and how we're doing with the conservation objectives on one hand in relation to the institutional aspect, but also with the indigenous communities. We have these different scenarios year after year when it comes to meetings, and we conduct analysis and reflection processes regarding the status or the coordination, but understood as governance, and what is happening in the territory, and what we are doing, if it helps or contributes or not. And maybe, Stanley, sometimes it is difficult to convey our ideas, but when it comes to these communities, when they have these rituals, in the case of Yaigohe, they have something special. And when it comes to the cultural management, they are able to identify which are the things that are going to affect things that they will have to face. And I think that this has been key for us, because you might say, well, these are things that are related to how we can adapt. But I think that they have these special rituals, so they are able to see the future threats for the territory, and the work that will be implied. And you also talked about mechanisms for financing, right? Well, in our case, more than a mechanism, we have resources that come directly from the parks, and we also have an administration mechanism, which is an agreement that we have. So year after year, we can define the action and define the results regarding that mechanism. And of course, we have strategic alliances, but definitely we see how necessary it is to have a financial sustainability mechanism in the medium and long term, in order to ensure the continuity of these processes and these types of things, because sometimes the resources that we have at the national park are not enough. And also these allies are going to have their own interests. So I think that we definitely need the sustainability mechanism. I saw that in Peru, they have interesting things regarding this topic. And I think that there is a lot that we can learn from them. And to conclude, you mentioned conflict, and I would say Well, essential for a conflict is to define common principles for this relation. In our case, we have respect, and we also have a principle that we all are learning from at the park, and is about reciprocity, because by this I mean that we must consider not only what the territory brings, but we must take people into consideration. And this has been a great lesson learned. Also, principles are also key, and agreements as well. But having agreements does not mean that we'll never have to face a conflict. Of course we will. But remember that I mentioned that good marriages are going to face conflict as well, and they're going to have difficulties and problems. But I do believe that we must have the will, so that when we come across these types of things, we'll be able to solve them. In our case, we have coordination. So if we have a conflict, we must analyze and solve it. But we also see how necessary it is to have strategies, because nowadays one of the things that generate the most tension is not only the activities that we have, but we have pressure on these protected areas. So sometimes we stop and think about it. But our colleague from Peru also mentioned this, and Jacqueline as well. So definitely we need these strategies, and we call them sustainable economic alternatives. And I think that this is necessary. We must have this harmony between the use of these cultural and also the sustainable development. But I think that this is a challenge not only for protected areas and for this mechanism, but I think that it's a human challenge, the way things are currently, and the situation of the planet led to all of these. So definitely we need all of these. And as our colleague from Peru said, we'll always have to face conflict. That is something that we cannot avoid. So we need to have an open mind, and we must look for ways and innovation to face whatever we need to. That would be for all for me. Thank you. There are some elements that I would like to rescue, talking about principles when it comes to relationships, the ethics, of course, of this marriage that you mentioned, and also how to handle things in an ethical manner. I think that the three speakers mentioned this, and also the formality of the way in which we relate to others, and also to have mechanisms, and also work based on agreements that has been mentioned. And of course, evidently, when we work with the communities, we must include the interest for the local development and the conservation. And those are the things that I can rescue from all these three answers. Cristina, I think we have some questions. Before we move on, can I have a couple of seconds to say something? Well, when it comes to economic sustainability of the Amaracaire Reserve, we have this mechanism that I mentioned. And what it really is to take advantage of the ecosystem services that have been generated by these areas. So in this case, we are really close to start the commercializations of carbon bonds. So this is going to provide sustainability to our executor, and it is also going to allow to have the right handling for these surveillance activities and control as well. Well, that's the advantage of having a partner that is on the private sector as well, so that they can be more agile when it comes to action taking. And of course, having this support is also important. And I would like to add Edgar, particularly because we have questions for him on the chat. So maybe can you go to the chat and start answering the questions that are addressed to you? Because we don't have much time. So we'll have to be very concise. Yes, that's what I wanted to say. We have individual questions, so I would ask the speakers to start answering the chat, and we also have other that are for all of them. And Asbin, you also have questions for you on the chat. Giancarlo Martinez from Venezuela is asking for everyone if these governance processes that you were mentioning have resulted in changes in the laws in your countries to adapt to the processes, or on the contrary, if you have a prior legal basis that helped the implementation. Regarding all of this is a question for the three speakers. And something else, if you could share an experience regarding the participative community monitoring for the management of the protected areas that you represent.
Por aquí.
Jacqueline, adelante, un minutito, Jacqueline, muy rápido porque tenemos...
Jacqueline, you have only 1 minute. Well, as for the legislation, we had a prior legal basis that was quite accurate, but what we are currently adapting it to the space and time in order to update our laws to be able to include, when necessary, the power of the indigenous communities. And as for monitoring, we are also training new firefighters and park rangers, and we are trying to work with all the systems of these communities so that we can ensure that constant monitoring that we cannot do if we are outside this territory. Thank you, Jacqueline. Asbin? I apologize. I was trying to answer to the questions on the chat. So, well, can you repeat the question, please? Well, is that the legal framework already existed on your country for this governance structure, or if it was created now for this proposal, and if you have any monitoring experiences? Well, first, the community reserves in Peru have not existed for a long time. We are in a permanent construction process, and we are preparing different documents that are going to allow to have this shared governance. So this is an ongoing process, and we are updating all these documents, as I mentioned, because we have these umbrella documents for these reserves that are being created, and we continue with this process. I don't know if we have Marco Arenas from Cernam, and this is precisely the unit that we are working with to prepare all the documents, and also with the Association of Executors of these agreements. So this is an ongoing process. And as for the community monitoring, yes, we do have constant monitoring, and we do it in a participating way. And we have the head of this community reserve, because as I said, this is a governance and management of this area that we share. So I think that this mechanism is something that we constantly work together on. Thank you, Asbin. Edgar? Well, there is a question related to the existing laws or policies in our countries for governance, or if we are creating it. Well, in the case of Colombia, we have both. We had not only a policy, but in our constitution, we have the indigenous communities, because Colombia has been one of the strongest countries regarding the protection of indigenous rights. But when it comes to mechanisms, we've had at these protected areas to build and generate not only the technical elements, but also the political and legal aspects that are going to help to adapt to this institutionality. And in our case, both things have been present to be able to attain these mechanisms. And there is also a question related to the advantage of these communities. And going back to the marriage, in the case of Yaigoje, what would have happened if we didn't have this marriage? Well, I think that this is an initiative from the indigenous communities, because they had a strong threat to the integrity of their territories on behalf of a foreign mining company that wanted to go into one of these sites. It is a sacred place, and they wanted to extract gold. So they saw that the only way to prevent this was with these protected areas. But so they have to go through all of these processes in order to attain this. But if without this marriage, I think that the integrity of this territory and all that is related to this management and all these indigenous communities would have been strongly affected. So and also the heritage and everything. So I think that the marriage in this case is something that is like a double protection. And there is also a question that, but I don't know where it was. And what about the difficulties when it comes to communication? Well, in here, I would say that communication must be understood, because most of the communities that we have still have their own language. So this exercise with them is not only about translation, but we must also generate an interpretation of what they need. So we must establish this intercultural dialogue, and this is also going to imply methodologies, work, communication, because oftentimes we try to explain things by comparing everything to the elements that they have on their territory. So we must adapt it to the elements, even if they are technical. And I think that this is something that, in my case, it is my duty to at least try to understand at least one of the languages that we have on the territory. And I think that it is a challenge for all of us. If we are not part of the territory, we must try to read the territory and, I don't know, try at least to read the languages and to promote all these languages to be learned.
Bien, muchas gracias, Edgar.
Very well. Thank you very much, Edgar. Very well. We no longer have sufficient time for more questions. We've gone over the allotted time frame. We're always used to, and we would like to see if we could do this now, if we could ask all three lecturers to make a final comment, because we're over our allotted time. So we'd like to ask you to share one message, but it has to be really a brief message. What would you tell managers of protected areas based on your experiences? What message, what takeaway would you share? Well, 1 minute message. Jacqueline? Yeah, well, for all of the managers, empathy, a lot of understanding, and always the respect for their ancestral culture, in particular in parks with indigenous computers. As an institution alone, we cannot do it. We always have to work hand in hand with them, little by little, so that we can consolidate the sustainability of our environments.
Gracias, Jacqueline. Has been.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Jasmine? Yes, thank you very much. I think that one of the key aspects in the management of protected areas, which is key for what we're doing, I think that this is said time and time again by our colleague Marco Arenas. There's no conservation if you don't do it with a focus on the people. So conservation hand in hand with development is the only way of doing effective management in a protected area. Thank you. Thank you, Jasmine.
Su mensaje.
Bueno, yo,
Edgar, your message?
territorios indígenas, áreas
Well,
protegidas.
I would say that indigenous areas, protected areas, and conservation for life, that is kind of the first phrase. And then there's a second one, which is to call for a reflection, which right now, worldwide, there's an acknowledgement of the importance of biodiversity on the planet. I think that here we face an enormous challenge with regards to the importance of cultural diversity. Nowadays, every second, every minute, there's an extinction of languages, of knowledge, and that is final for the survival of humanity.
Gracias,
And with that,
Edgar.
I say goodbye. Thank you, Stanley.
Gracias, Jacqueline, por el esfuerzo de
Thank you, Edgar. Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Jacqueline, for the effort of having presented, of having come out today to share.
Los que puedan abrir sus videos, vamos a tomar una
For
foto.
those of you who want to share their videos, those who are still in the activity today, Paula will take a picture. So open your videos, please, while Paula take the pictures, and you keep an eternal smile for a whole minute. It takes Paula to take the picture. To all of you, so please smile and keep smiling. Maria Gusa, you're very serious, so please smile. We don't want to be too serious. Elia. Minutes, more or less. Okay, then you have to keep it for 20 minutes, more or less. So I have to take 3 pictures, so keep the smile, please.
Esta sonrisa, les comento que
This smile, I'll let you know that in about a week's time, we'll have another webinar, and through the social networks and other means, we will be sharing the link
para inscribirse.
to enter, to enroll,
Hablar,
and we will speak. We will hear from Marcia about a presentation of a video about an experience for community planning that is very nice in the state of the Amazon. You will see all the participating communities. We will see the participation of Brazil for the state of the Amazon. We'll have Giancarlo Martinez explaining how it was created based on a social movement, an indigenous social movement. That was taken from a category of sustainable use to a much more restrictive category by request of the indigenous communities themselves. And we'll speak of Bolivia, of Carolina Martinez, the Suriname of Bolivia, the case of how we did participative management through the Council of Management of National Parks. These 3 cases, we will look at them next week. And so Marcia's over there. sending out a greeting. Marcia will be the lecturer. And thank you all for participating today at this webinar. We thank you very much for your presence and for sharing your time with us today.
Muchísimas gracias. De ahí
para
lo
todos.
puede hacer
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Greetings to all.